Folks, I like to make it a surprise. So we're doing section Q, relations and functions, and we're going to identify independent and dependent variables. So this is going to be a surprise for me. Hopefully it works out nice. Let's see what they're going to ask us. Okay. The grader his final test score will be. Okay. His final test score, it's saying, depends on how many questions he answers correctly. So the number of questions he answers correctly is the independent variable, and the dependent variable is his final score on the test. It doesn't work like this. He doesn't get to decide, oh, I'm going to get a 90 on my test so that the person will put a certain number of correct questions on the test for him. It works the other way around. So the independent variable is Q is the number of questions and S is the dependent variable. So that's the one we want. So it seems to be working out pretty good. Okay. Berta goes biking every morning. The farther she bikes, the more calories she burns. So biking is the independent variable because she gets to decide that. And then that will, the calories she burns depends on how many, how much distance she bikes. So it's independent is D is the distance, it's the independent, and C is the dependent. So we want to get these in the right direction. Wayne has a summer mowing job. The amount of money he earns is determined by how many lawns he mows. So lawns he mows are the independent, and the amount of money he gets depends on how many lawns he mows. So M is the amount of money. So M is dependent, and L, the number of lawns, is the independent. So it's this one right here. How long they need to wait before they can get to the front of the line. The more people in line, okay, so the number of people in line ahead of them, that is the independent variable. This is our X value, that's P. The longer they have to wait. So the time they have to wait is the dependent, because the time they have to wait depends on how many people are in line, and this is their wait time. So P is the independent and W is the dependent. Hopefully these are clear. Okay, Quinn works as a server. The amount of money she earns depends. So the amount of money she earns, M, is dependent on the number of tables she serves. T is the independent. So the more tables she serves, the more money she makes. T is the independent and M is the dependent. So students in Edna's Spanish class are planning a trip to Guatemala, during which they'll stay at local host families. The number of host families will need, okay, so the number of host families is the dependent, isn't it? Which is F. So F is the dependent, and students, the number of students going on the trip is the independent. That one right there. Okay, Herman's, in order to earn extra money, they work at wedding receptions. The amount of money they earn, so that's M, is the dependent, because it says it depends on the length of the reception. So R is the independent, because that's how long the reception is determines how much money they make. So R is independent, M is the dependent. The number of students receiving diplomas. Okay, number of students receiving diplomas dictates the duration of the graduation ceremony. So the duration of the graduation ceremony, which is D, depends on the number of students, doesn't it? This is the independent. So the number of students is the independent and the duration is the dependent. Okay, the number of bands that will be able to play at the festival is determined by the amount of time the venue has been reserved for. So the reservation is T, that's the amount of time. This is the independent. Time is almost always your independent variable. And the number of bands, which is B, is the dependent. T is independent, B is dependent. Okay, the cost of a customer's order determines the amount of tax due. So the cost of the order is the independent, and the tax will depend on how much the cost is. So T is the independent. Nope. T is the dependent, and C, the cost of the coffee, is the independent. There we go. Got to make sure I write them down so don't get them confused. Okay, so L is the number of lifeguards and S is the expected number of swimmers. So the number of lifeguards, I actually had to do this problem a lot. The number of lifeguards depends, this is the dependent variable, on how many swimmers are expected to visit the pool on that day. And that is that's a lot determined by the weather. So this is the independent, is the number of swimmers, and L is the dependent. The number of squares she cuts will depend. So the number of squares is S, and that is the dependent. So S is the dependent, P is the independent, the number of people. I'm going to go a little faster. If you can identify one or the other, then the other one is obviously the other way. Okay, in a bowling class, the students are organized into teams. The number of teams is calculated based on how many students are in the class. So the independent is the students in class, and that depends, the number of team depends on how many students are in the class, doesn't it? That would be T. Okay. The amount of money she earns depends. M is the dependent, and H is the number of hours she works. That's the independent. Again, time is independent. Money is generally dependent. Okay, the number of roses in her shop determines, so the roses is the independent, determines the number of bouquets she can assemble, because the number of roses leads to a certain number of bouquets, which depends on how many roses you have available, which is the dependent variable, is the bouquets. So in this case, the team is the independent, is the students. We'll go a little faster now since they only want us to do one or the other. Okay, so Sam's getting ready for a hike. The number of snacks is determined by, so snacks is the dependent because the number of snacks depends on how many hours, doesn't it? And so the snacks is the one that's the dependent. Rita's buying birthday candles. The number of boxes is based on years. So the number of candles depends on the age, doesn't it? So the independent is the age in years. Again, time. All right. She's planning a picnic. The number of veggie burgers she prepares depends. So the number of veggie burgers is the dependent, isn't it? And we're almost done. It's going. All right. Billy is making goodie bags for the child's party. is buying bottles of bubbles for the bags. The number of party guests determines how many bottles he'll buy. So the guests will determine the number of bottles, won't it? So the bottles depends on the number of guests, and they want independent. So that's going to be the number of guests. Okay, going on a road trip. They have to consider different routes and calculate the cost of gas for each route. The longer the route, the greater the cost of the gas. So the cost of the gas, which is G, depends on how long the route is. So this is the dependent, and the length of the route is the independent, which is the length of the route. Every morning, Debbie runs laps around the track for 1 hour. The faster her speed, the more laps she is able to run. So her speed is independent. She decides how fast she runs, and that will determine how many laps or R she runs. So which one is the dependent? This is the dependent. The number of laps depends on the speed she runs, and R is the number of laps. Okay, we have another runner who purchases a new pair of running shoes every 300 miles. The number of miles determines how many pairs of shoes she buys, not the other way around. If she buys more shoes, it doesn't mean that she automatically has that many miles under her belt, because I guarantee I know a lot of people that buy lots of shoes and they don't run the miles. So the miles are the independent, that's how many miles, and the number of shoes, which is P, is the dependent. The independent is the miles, isn't it? Okay, the duration of the ceremony is dictated by how many students. So the students is the independent, and the duration of the ceremony is the dependent. And we want the dependent, so that's the duration of the ceremony, which is D, because the duration depends on the number of students. We're getting there. Okay, the amount of trail mix depends. So the amount of trail mix is the dependent variable, and that depends on the length of the trip. We want the independent, then, is the length of the trip. The number of coworkers attending will determine how many sandwiches she orders. So the number of sandwiches depends on how many coworkers. So this is the independent, and the dependent is the S, isn't it? The number of sandwiches will depend on the number of coworkers. And we're almost there. 2 more, it looks like. They're going to make me go all the way. Kinsey is decorating antique picture frames. The number of gifts she can create is determined by the number of frames she has. So the frames, the number of frames, which is F, is the independent. And the gifts that she gives depends on how many frames she has. So the dependent variable are the gifts she gives. And we have one last one. This is our last one. Kurt brings reusable shopping bags. The number of products in his shopping list determines how many bags he brings. So the products are the independent variable, and the number of bags he needs, which is B, is depends on how many products, doesn't it? And so the independent is the number of products. That's the independent, which is P. And I hope you guys will try it yourself, get to your 100 and master this guy, and I'll see you back again. Bye.